So today we'll be working on a ice cream sundae watercolor. So the important thing when trying to do something that's in glass is we're really leaving a lot of your white highlights showing. And then I normally start with kind of the colors that are inside of my glass and then go over it with a light wash of gray to kind of start, making it seem like it's behind that layer. Because if I leave these colors as bright as these, it's not going to look like it's inside the glass. So with this, I decided not to do the little, twirls on the sundae, and I'll have to decide if I want to do nuts or do sprinkles instead. So with this, I'm first going to start with kind of my main ice cream color, which I'm going to keep it like my reference, and I'm going to start making a cream color. So to make a cream color, a really great way to make that is sometimes you can start with Van Dyke brown and a lot of water, and it kind of makes a brownish beige, and then adding a little yellow ochre. But sometimes that's a little bit too, creamy, because that would be more like peanut butter flavored rather than vanilla ice cream. So, but in this kind of reference, you could always follow the photo and then decide to do different colors, but still follow, the same values. So I can probably tone down this yellow a little bit by adding some cadmium yellow and then a little bit of my Payne's gray. And then it's kind of a grayish yellow. And then that's kind of my shadow color for my ice cream. And over here, I'm gonna mix kind of my main ice cream color. Just a really, really, really light wash of yellow ochre. So what I'm gonna do first is with this nice cream color, I'm just gonna go over everything except for white on my ice cream, because those little lovely white spaces are really going to add a lot of contrast to my picture. So I might leave some little areas of white every so often. And I'm always looking at my reference, because sometimes, we always forget to draw something in, or we accidentally paint over something that we shouldn't have. So it's good to kind of be looking at your reference as you're working on this. And I'm also going to do a really light wash of that color down here. And I'm really making sure to stay away from those white highlights that are on my glass. I could also have come in and used masking fluid on it. A little bit over there. And then I'm also going to take some of this creamy shadow color, and I can add a little more gray to it. And I'm actually going to use this color to do some shadows on my cream. Just a little bit. And then I'm also going to come in with some brown. I'm just going to do a really light layer. And you don't really have to stay within the lines exactly. I'm going to be doing my ink on top of this once it's a little drier. So it's perfectly fine to have some slip-ups. And I can even have my ice cream, and I think it's like a layer of fudge or something, kind of blend a little bit into each other. Great, and then while that's drying, I'm going to go ahead and do a really light layer on my cherry, and then we'll probably come back in and start working on our ink. And as I'm doing this red, I'm kind of starting in my shadow areas. And then as I start getting into my lighter areas, I'm going to start using a little bit of yellow and water. And then a good amount of water up here where I have those really bright highlights. And that gives a really nice roundness to my cherry. So if you're really worried about bleeding, because sometimes with ice cream, that little redness in the cherry actually bleeds a little bit into the whipped cream. But if you're really worried about that bleeding and don't want that, you could always wait until the whipped cream's completely dry. I kind of like a little bit of bleeding in those areas. And I'm going to take a little bit of red and put it where my stem is and do a really, really light wash again of that red, trying to keep my brush nice and thin. Right there. I'm going to blend a little bit of that into the rest of my cherry. There you go. Just keep it nice and light. And I'll come back in and do some more shadows on that. So then as this is dry now, I'm going to start at the bottom of my painting to start some of my inking, because up there is still pretty wet. So and I'm just kind of going over it with a 01 just because it's pretty thin. Right now I'm basically just outlining. And some things you could have left without ink and just done, with the masking fluid. And then as I'm outlining my ice cream, I'm trying to still kind of go with the texture of the ice cream where it's not perfectly smooth. It's a little bumpy versus, the drips down here are going to be very smooth. And that gives a really good contrast to those two layers rather than having everything look exactly the same. And I'm going to do a little bit of texture to cover some of my pencil lines. I'm going to go over some of my whipped cream. And I could either just leave and paint in my highlights, or like on the the fudge, chocolate sauce, whatever you want to call it. Or I could kind of draw it in a little bit. That's kind of up to you. Sometimes it's good to have less lines. And this isn't too wet, so I'm going to go ahead and very lightly and carefully go over that section. You have to be careful if you do have a wet section on your painting, not to go over it with ink, but luckily mine wasn't too wet. And then on my whipped cream, I'm actually going to come in and do some little shading where I'm going to do some little dashes for some of those shadows. And that's up to you again, if you want to leave some of those in there and just have the lines be the whipped cream, or you can draw some of that in. That's up to you. And I normally like to do a little bit of shadowing in between layers. So I'm doing some little hatching underneath that whipped cream. Maybe I'll put a little bit underneath some of these areas, very lightly though. Because if you get too dark, you know, lines, then it looks too dark and kind of clashes with the bright and light feeling we're trying with this one. So now what we're going to do is start working on a nice light layer for our chocolate sauce. So I'm going to use that same brown, which is just my Van Dyke brown, and I'm going to do a really light coat of it everywhere, except for my little white spots. Which I have already outlined a little bit. I also want to look at how there's a little bit of brown behind the whipped cream, like that. And then while that's wet, I'm going to take a little bit more of my brown, and I can make that even darker by adding a little bit of blue to it, because blue is pretty close a complement to brown, because brown is so similar to orange. So I can start by dropping in some of those darks while it's still wet, just because I'm keeping it a little looser. Great. And then now we're going to go back in and start adding some gray to our glass. So with my gray, I'm going to be using some Payne's gray and adding a little bit of brown to it to kind of neutralize it, so then it's more of a, you know, medium gray rather than a bluey gray, because Payne's gray is a really good bluey gray. And then now I'm just looking for areas where my glass is gray and leaving some of those little white highlights. They're in some of those areas. There's also a little bit of gray right here. And there's definitely some on top of our lovely ice cream. So I'm just going to do a really light wash in there. And then later on I'm going to have to go a little bit darker with my chocolate. And there's also actually a little bit of brown that got over and is reflected over here. So we're going to do a little bit of that as I'm adding another layer of my brown. And then for my ice cream, I'm going to start adding some of those little shadows. That was with my yellow ochre kind of mixture. Make that nice cream. And I'm going to look for how, you know, the highlights are really on kind of this side of the ice cream, and it's kind of a little dark in here. And I'm not trying to paint it like a perfect shape, you know, I'm still trying to match kind of that texture that the ice cream has. So I'm kind of leaving it a little bit dappled in some areas. I'm also going to take a little gray I'm just going to kind of put it in with the yellow. You know, you don't want it too much or else it looks like gross ice cream. Very nice. Okay. And then on my whipped cream, we're just coming in with a little bit more shadows. just for some contrast. And I'm going to do some more red, because right now red's kind of sad looking. So I'm just doing another layer of cadmium red, because it's a really nice bright red. And I'm just trying to fade it into the light red I have at the top of my cherry. And then I'm going to put some nice dark red right in front of my stem, which you can make a nice dark red by adding a little green, or sometimes even adding a little alizarin crimson to your red. And I'm going to take some Naples yellow, just a really light wash, and kind of go over some of my grays to have a little bit of happier yellow in there. A little bit of it in here, because we want it gray, but we don't want it to be dead. And then I could add some like little sprinkles if I wanted to on my ice cream, which I normally start by just doing like some little dashes of the one color. And you want to try and use some colors that aren't, around so much. Like I wouldn't want to just do red, because since the cherry is so red, I could probably do some pinks though, or some purples. You want it to feel very random. And once that's a little bit drier, then I can do another coat of that same color on the bottom of the sprinkle. And it gives it a little bit of depth. And I would want to come back in with a little bit of a darker brown, because right now my brown's kind of sad looking, and just look for any areas where I have a lot of shadows. Maybe areas underneath the whipped cream, on one side of the chocolate sauce. And then I'm going to kind of come in with my water and just kind of try and gently blend it just a little bit. And there you go. So that's how you start a nice little ice cream. So I could have some fun with it. Like if it was for someone's birthday, I could write on there, happy birthday, and then do some splattering around there, do some balloons. I love doing splatters on this kind of thing and just kind of tapping some fun colors. And remember, if it gets anywhere you don't really want it to be, you can always come in and touch it with a little bit of water. I'm actually doing this to kind of get the color to spread a little bit. But see, in these areas, I could lift it up a little bit. You can even add fun colors to your glass. Like instead of just having it gray, you could have some other reflections of different colors. And it's a little more festive. The last little thing I would do is if there are any like dark gray shadows, I would come back in and kind of emphasize those. Besides that, our ice cream is done. But it's all about layers. You know, it's good to step away from your picture and then come back. And a lot of times, you know, once the color's dry, it'll look a little different and we'll see it in a different light.